Okay, welcome to the lecture for research methods. We're talking about the first part of Chapter 6 of the APA manual, crediting sources. The second part of this chapter, in terms of how to write your reference list, we'll talk about at a later time. So the question of when to cite, this question is covered in more detail in other lecture materials, so I won't go into too much detail here. Just kind of a quick review in terms of when to cite and consequently how to avoid plagiarizing. First of all, obviously when you're using someone else's words or ideas, you need to provide a citation. So if you read something, hear something on a video, at a presentation, some idea, the way somebody says something, and you want to use that in your published work, you need to provide a citation identifying the original source of that material. And most people are pretty comfortable with that. The thing that some people aren't aware of is the need to provide a citation when using your own words and ideas if you've previously published them. People think, oh well, it's my stuff. I wrote it. I don't need to cite myself. I own it. And technically, you may own it, but you still need to provide a citation if it was previously published. And again, this for the APA manual only applies to published work. But if, say, you wrote a paper for a class, you didn't publish it, but you turned it into a class. If you were then asked to write a paper over a similar topic in another class, you think, oh, well, I'll just use that same paper or maybe some pieces of it. That wouldn't be plagiarism according to the APA manual because it's not published, but it would be a violation of the academic honesty policy at the university. So you don't want to do that. And if you do need to reference something else you wrote previously, provide a citation, but better not to do that because the expectation is in academic work, in coursework, that you're going to be doing new work each time and not recycling things you've done before. Because the purpose of the assignment is to get you to think about the material, and if you're just recycling something from before, you're not thinking about it again in the context of the current class. Okay, so you cite when you're using other people's words or ideas or your own previously published words or ideas, and then you're generally pretty good in terms of being safe from not committing plagiarism. However, I put in here, it's also important that you cite correctly and sufficiently, because if you don't, you might still be committing plagiarism. And that's why we're going to go into some detail about how to cite, because it's not just a mistake. It might be plagiarism if it's not clear, if your error leads it to be not clear what material you're citing, where it came from, or whether or not it's a quote or not. Okay, so with all this, it may seem like you have to cite everything. And if you're asked to write a research paper on a topic, a lot of it will be cited. There'll be few sentences that aren't cited. For the introduction to a research paper or a research proposal, the introduction section that sets the stage for your study, by and large, most sentences will include a citation. Because there's only two instances when you don't have a citation. One of those is whenever you're presenting your own ideas or opinions. And obviously you don't need to cite those, unless of course you've published them elsewhere. But and you think, well, if everything needs a citation, does that mean I won't give my opinion very much? And honestly, not in the way of giving your opinion of how you think things are, how you think people are. Your opinions that don't need citations will be whenever you're drawing connections between other ideas. So if you cite two ideas and then you say, okay, the difference between these things is blah blah blah, or these things have this something in common, that is your idea. That connection is your idea. If you come up with some new idea, okay, I read this, so and so said this, so and so said this, but this could be the way it really is. Kind of a suggestion after citing other sources. That's your opinion, and those things don't need citations. But just saying, how you think men are, or women are, or children are, that's not where something that goes in a research paper. Research papers talk about the knowledge that has been documented, and then hypotheses about knowledge yet to be discovered. So your own opinions, those connections, and then generally hypotheses. The other instance where you won't cite, other than your own ideas and hypotheses, will be if something is common knowledge. And kind of major historical facts are typically okay. That the first president of the United States with George Washington. You don't need to provide a citation for that. Um, but my recommendation is anything that sounds at all like a statistic, um, even if you think, oh, that's probably true, like, you know, the average person, um, generates more trash uh, today than 10 years ago. That's probably true, but you need to, even if you just, you didn't read that somewhere, you just kind of think it's true. If it's something that sounds at all kind of statistical or fact-like, other than kind of major historical commonly acknowledged things, go track down a source to confirm it and cite it. That way, you're less likely to be accused of plagiarism, and you're more likely to present accurate information, because you obviously don't want to present things that seem like facts when there's no documentation that it is a fact. Okay, so on to how to cite. When citing material from another source, generally you're either going to be quoting that source, so using the exact words that you read or heard, or you're going to be paraphrasing, putting it into your own words. And sometimes the line between paraphrasing and quoting can be difficult for people to discern, and it's important because how you cite the material will differ depending on if it's a quotation or a paraphrase. So my general rule is the 4-word rule. If you're using 4 or more major words, words longer than 4 letters, consecutively that are exactly the same as the original author, put all those words that are the same within quotation marks to indicate that it's a quote and cite it as a quote. If you change some of the other words in the sentence, don't put quotes around the ones you changed, but do put quotes around the author's original words. And you'd only do that if they just said something the perfect way, and you can't think of any way of saying it any better. I mean, in general, you want to paraphrase as much as possible, because that's part of the purpose of writing is ingesting the material, processing it, and then having it come back out through your lens of experience in a paraphrase rather than just repeating somebody else's words. You want to talk about their ideas, but in the context of your current paper and your understanding of whatever it is you're talking about. The other thing that isn't a violation of APA policy per se is, you could, if you had there's a sentence in another source, like, wow, that's really well said. Well, I don't want to use a quote because I'm not supposed to use too many quotes. I'll just get out my thesaurus, or I'll use my Word software and change every word with a synonym. A, that's lazy. B, it usually ends up with a pretty crappy sentence whose meaning isn't consistent with the meaning of the original sentence, because synonyms, are helpful, but many words have very precise meanings, and changing a word to a synonym can lose the meaning that was originally intended. And it's also, doing this defeats one of the major purposes of writing in our field, which, as I said before, is to think about material and process it, and then put it back through your own filter. So that's what I want to see you doing, not just using synonyms to change words. And also, if you do that, in my opinion, you're still plagiarizing the structure of the sentence, even though the AP manual currently is a little ambiguous about whether or not that is prohibited. So not technically plagiarism, but a bad idea. So don't do it. Okay. So when you paraphrase, what material do you need to present in your citation? The author and the year, and it's all the authors. If there's just one, the first one. If there's more than one, all of them up to a point. The last names of the authors, and the year of publication. You don't need the day or the month, even if you know it. You don't need that. And then the page number or paragraph number is recommended, but not required if you're paraphrasing. So now, if it's a quotation, some overlap here. Still authors' names and the year, but now the page number or paragraph number is required, and that seems one of the major distinction. One of the major distinctions between how to cite when you paraphrase and when you quote. Obviously, with quotations, you're going to be using quotation marks or a block quote, and with paraphrasing or not. The other thing is that page number, and without the page number, that's insufficient citation. may constitute plagiarism to some people who evaluate your work. So be sure to do that properly. And you notice it says page or paragraph number, and the preferred is the page number, but there's a recognition that not all material has page numbers. It's not all paginated, especially if you're looking at getting a source that's online or from an online journal. It may not have page numbers, and or a technical report from some institution may not have page numbers. And if that's the case, you cite the paragraph number, but again, the page number is preferred. Some more details on quotations later, but for now we'll kind of go through looking at paraphrasing and quoting, things that they have in common. Okay. So when we look at, we know what information goes in a citation, but now we need to talk about where it goes. And you really have two choices. It can either be incorporated into the sentence as part of the narrative, or it can be put in parentheses at the end of the cited material. And when I say at the end of the cited material, typically that means at the end of the sentence, but not necessarily. You may have a sentence that two phrases separated by a conjunction or semicolon, and the first phrase comes from a source, and the second phrase is your own opinion or comes from another source. In that case, that first phrase, the citation for that, where it came from, goes before the conjunction, not at the end of the sentence, so at the end of the phrase. Okay. And hopefully that'll make more sense as we look at some examples. Like I just said. Now, for the examples, there'll be some slight differences in how you cite things depending on the number of authors. Start with the simplest when there's one author. Here's an example of a paraphrase. Author's last name is Benjamin. Work was published in 2009. So we have Benjamin found that men tend to have more difficulty dealing with rejection than women. There's no page number here. There's no quotation marks because it's a paraphrase. The words were changed sufficiently. The sentence structure changed sufficiently not to need quoting. And this is an example where the citation material is incorporated into the narrative of the sentence, not at the end. And even when it's included in the narrative, the year still goes in parentheses generally. You don't. Sometimes, we could have had here in 2009 Benjamin published a study, and in that case 2009 wouldn't be in parentheses. But you won't typically do that unless there's something important about the year, and you're going to talk about 5 years later she published a retraction of that study. In those cases, you might do that, but generally the year is always going to go in parentheses. Another little side note here before I look at quotation. You notice here I didn't say Benjamin 2009 conducted a study and found, which I see students doing quite a bit. We'll talk later, we'll talk more about style of writing. One of the key principles is parsimony. Use as few words as possible to say what you need to say. And if I say Benjamin found blah blah blah, most readers in this field understand, okay, Benjamin didn't just find that on the side of the road. Benjamin found it by conducting a study. So you don't need to say conducted a study and found. You just cut out that first part. The only times you'll probably want to say conducted a study is when there's something important about how the study was conducted. Maybe conducted a study with Israeli immigrants, or conducted a study that used in vivo exposure. But in general, you don't need to say conducted a study because that's understood. Okay. So another example, still using the citation material as part of the narrative, but now a quote. So Benjamin 2009, so that's still the same, found that, and then we open quotes where the exact words begin, blah blah blah, go to the end quotes, and then parentheses, the page on which that quotation appeared, period. So one thing to notice, the end punctuation, the period at the end of the sentence, doesn't go inside the quotation marks. It goes after the parentheses, after the page number. And for most people it kind of looks okay here, but if a quote's a question, it looks a little funny because you've got a question mark here after the parentheses, which it looks funny to me too, but that's what the APA manual says, so go ahead and do that even if it looks a little funny. So the end punctuation goes after the page number at the end of the sentence. Another thing you may notice is the page number part of the citation and the year are separated here. And that won't always be the case, but it always will be the case that the page number goes immediately following the quoted material, regardless of where the author and year are. The page number always goes at the end of the quote. Okay. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, still looking at with single author, but now looking at what happens when we provide the citation material at the end of the citation. So again, we have a paraphrase starting off. Men tend to have more difficulty dealing with rejection than women. Parentheses, author name, comma, space, year of publication, in parentheses, and then your in punctuation again, always after the last parentheses with cited material. Pretty straightforward there. And again, nowhere in there do I say, somebody conducted a study. All I'm saying, when I do this, and I write it this way, it indicates to the reader that Benjamin did a study showing that men have more difficulty. If I had said, some people think men tend to have more difficulty dealing with rejection than women, and put citation in there, then that indicates that it's Benjamin's opinion and not necessarily a study done by Benjamin. So I state it as kind of a fact, provide a citation, then the assumption is that there was a study done documenting that. Okay. So now looking at a similar thing with the quote. So the author of an earlier study found that, open quote, there's the quote, blah, blah, blah. In quotes again, no period inside the quotation marks. And then we have author name, comma, year, comma, page number. So here, all citation material together inside the parentheses, but still the page number being the last thing. Okay. And then to show you one other kind of variation, here I've got a sentence combining material from two sources. And the first one with a quote, the second with a paraphrase. The first one with the citation at the end of the cited material, and then the second one with the cited material incorporated as part of the narration. So, in contrast to an earlier study that found that blah blah, and I get that same quote. So at the end of the quote, I need to put the citation now, Benjamin 2009, page 247. And I could have begun that sentence with Benjamin 2009 found that. There's my quote. Then I have a page number, and now instead of a period at the end, I'm going to have a comma because I have an opening phrase and then a closing phrase. And the closing phrase is another study. Davis 2010 found that women have more difficulty than men in dealing with rejection. So two kind of opposing studies that I can juxtapose them within one sentence, and I just need to clearly identify which phrase goes with which author. Okay. Okay, so we'll stick with one author for a bit, but we'll look at kind of what happens if you cite that material again, so subsequent citations. So we have, Benjamin 2009 found that men, blah, 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 and as the next sentence I want to say something else about the same study without talking about my own opinion in between or any other study. Benjamin also noted that, blah, blah, I don't need to put the year. Again, APA gets a little weird here. And that's only if the first time, preceding that, I had the citation used as part of the narrative of the sentence. If I had it all within parentheses before this, I still have to repeat the year. And that's kind of a weird thing. So if you're not sure, just always put the year, and that'll be safe. But you don't have to put the year if you use the author and the year earlier in that same paragraph as part of the narrative. But again, once you move on to another paragraph, you want to repeat all the citation information, author and year again. If you have any material in between another citation, or in any way it'll be unclear what study you're talking about, provide all the citation information. So here's an example of the other thing I was talking about. So we have, men tend to have more difficulty, blah, blah. We cite Benjamin in parentheses, and it looks like there's extra space in there after Benjamin, so don't do that. We have that, and then I want to keep talking about Benjamin, but in the preceding citation, it didn't occur as part of the narrative, so now I've got to repeat the year, and that's the difference, which I don't know why they do that, but that's one of the silly rules of APA. So here's an example of, I've talked about Benjamin, and I say in contrast Davis found something, so now I've provided a different citation. And then I say, an explanation of this difference may be attributed to Benjamin's something or other. Now, since I've had an intervening citation, it's a good idea to go ahead and put the year again, just so it's easy for the reader to see as possible which study you're talking about. They don't get confused, especially if the names that are all similar. So anytime, again, there's any kind of intervening information, I'd recommend putting the year again. Okay, so now let's look at when we have two authors who wrote the paper or whatever it is that we're citing. So two authors to the source. A lot of stuff is still the same in terms of paraphrasing versus quoting. Quotations still go inside quotation marks and have a page number at the end. You still have the option of incorporating the citation as part of the narrative or at the end of the sentence. Some examples we see here: Benjamin and Davis found that men tend to have more difficulty doing blah blah blah. So we have Benjamin and Davis, the year. It's a paraphrase, nothing too startling, hopefully. And now we see a quote, and the citation at inside parentheses at the end. And this would be the same for a paraphrase, except without the page number, without the quotation marks. But then the other thing you'll notice is different between these two sentences, which is common between whether or not it's a paraphrase or a quote, but just differs on whether or not the citation is part of the narrative or inside parentheses. When it's inside parentheses, and you have more than one author, and you have an and connecting the authors, you use the ampersand, right? Hit Shift 7 on your keyboard to get that symbol. So the ampersand when you're connecting two authors inside parentheses, but if it's outside parentheses, it's part of the narrative, you use the word A and D, and that's really the only difference between one author and two authors. In terms of the rules for kind of subsequent citations, same as with one author, and you always name both authors in every subsequent citation. You don't just get to talk about one of them whenever there's two, which will be a little different, as we'll see in a minute, whenever you have more than two. Okay. So when you have more than two authors. So we have Benjamin, Davis, and Garcia, 2009, found something, so it's a quote. We've got the part of the citation included in the narrative, but again the page number has to go at the very end. And again we see since the and connecting authors isn't inside parentheses, it's the word and, not an ampersand. Compare the two. We've got it a little different here, a paraphrase, and also with the citation in parentheses at the end. So again, the only difference being we have an ampersand instead of the and. Okay. So where it gets a little different from the other stuff is with subsequent citations. So here I'm citing that article. The authors reported something. Benjamin, Davis, and Garcia, 2009. So we've got the ampersand. And then if I want to talk about that again, now I'm not going to say Benjamin, Davis, and Garcia. I'm not going to repeat that again. I'm going to say Benjamin et al. And I don't have the year after the et al. Because there's no intervening citations. So it's just like those rules earlier. Well, if it's in the same paragraph, you don't have to put the year again if you don't want to. But here, one thing that's different from two authors is after the first time you've cited something, even if you're citing it again later in a later paragraph, you're not going to repeat the author's names. You're going to use et al. It's important. It looks a little weird to a lot of people to have a period in the middle of a sentence, but that's part of that abbreviation for and the rest. So it's important to maintain that period when you have et al. And you're abbreviating the other authors that way. An exception to this will be if you have more than 5 authors. So let's say, for example, you had when that happens, you cite the first author only the first time. So generally, you cite all the authors the first time, unless there's just a whole lot of them, and a whole lot is more than 5, so 6 or more. So assume the authors were Benjamin, Davis, Garcia, Lee, Cartier, and Smith. If that were the case, the first time you cited it, it would be Benjamin et al. 2009. And then the subsequent citations would also be Benjamin et al. And notice here I do have the year in there, still have the period after the AL, so it's the author or authors, the author space ET space AL period space parentheses year parentheses. Okay. I know it seems kind of nitpicky to go into much detail, but you want to do it accurately to kind of comply with the style, so you're doing things professionally in the way that you're expected to do them. There is a really good table in your manual, table 6.1, that shows how to do citations of one author, two authors, three authors, groups as authors, both the first time you cite it and subsequent citations. To give some examples for that, I encourage you to look at that, and not just look at it once, but kind of bookmark that page in your book and use it as a reference when you're trying to do your citations in your paper. Okay. So sometimes you'll cite more than one source for the same idea. This isn't where you have an idea with a source and another idea with another source, like I showed earlier. This is when you have kind of one idea and more than one source. Maybe two studies found the same thing, or two different authors agreed on some particular point, and you want to cite them both. So here we have, men tend to have more difficulty dealing with rejection than women. Parentheses, Benjamin 2009, Davis 2010. So if I write that, then the reader thinks, okay, Benjamin found that, and Davis also found that. It's slightly different studies probably, but they both found that same main point. Important things to note about doing this: when you put them inside parentheses, they go in alphabetical order. So whatever order they're in your reference page, that's what order they go inside the parentheses. So Benjamin comes before Davis, and it doesn't matter for year, if they're different names, it's alphabetical first. And then the other thing is you separate each citation within the parentheses using a semicolon. Okay. Another thing to look out for is secondary sources. This is whenever you find you're reading an article and they cite somebody else who says something wonderful, a quote or an idea, and you want to use that. If you just cite the paper you read and you don't cite the one they cited, then that's plagiarism, because you're not giving the appropriate author credit for the idea. So there are two ways to deal with this. One, you can cite it as a secondary citation. So maybe you're reading Davis, and Benjamin says something that's just fabulous, and you can't find Benjamin's article. So you say, okay, I want to use it anyway. So if you use it, you say Benjamin 2009 contains that blah blah blah, and then you do parentheses as cited in Davis 2010, and then you'll put the Davis 2010 in your reference page. And that's acceptable, if you have to do it that way, but it's not the preferred way to do it. The preferred way to do it is to track down the Benjamin 2009 article, read that article, and then cite that article. And you don't have to cite Davis, unless you're quoting Davis's paraphrasing of Benjamin's work. But obviously don't do that. Paraphrase your own way. And the reason I say this is, one, Davis might have read Benjamin wrong. So there might be an error in what they're reporting, and you don't want to repeat that error because you didn't go check the original source. The other thing is, they might not be wrong, but you might disagree with them about their interpretation of what Benjamin said. You think, oh, well, they paraphrased this way, and I think that changed the meaning too much. What I think they meant was this. And you can't do that if you don't read the original work. So whenever you find a recent interesting article cited somewhere else, go track down that article and then cite that article. Another thing that comes up a lot, I'll talk a little about citing websites, which again you shouldn't do too much, but sometimes there's certain statistical information, census information that you can find online that you may not be able to find in other sources, and people are sometimes uncomfortable with how to cite things that come from websites, because the APA manual is still getting its feet wet in terms of how to do it. Generally, you put the author and the year. If there's identified author and identified year on there of when it was published, not the year you accessed it, but if it's an article published online, generally it'll be some year that they wrote it. It'll be dated, and you'll look for that. If there's no author, then what you put in the citation material, in the text or inside parentheses, will be the first few words of the title in quotation marks. So maybe there was an article that was about how people face rejection when blah 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 blah. So whenever you're citing that, you have whatever you said blah blah dealing with rejection, and then you go to cite it, you put quotes, how people face, in quotes, comma, and the year it was published. Okay. You don't put the whole title of the article. And this is, again, only when you don't have an author. You just put the first few words. And if there's not even a title, then it's just the first few words that are in the text on that page that you are going to direct people to in your reference page. Sometimes there may not be a year. If this happens, you put in period, D period, no spaces between those, in place of where the year would go in a regular citation. So maybe that article was written and Benjamin took credit for it, but there's no year of publication for this online thing. So you put Benjamin, comma, in period, D period, in parentheses, close punctuation. Okay. There's a lot of other stuff to read about that we won't have time to go into here, but I want you to read the manual and look at. And it's one of those things where you kind of read it and go, oh, okay, I know that's there, but you don't have to memorize it. The manual is a reference material, and it's something that you're going to go back to when doing your citations. But if you don't read it the first time, you won't know what things to kind of look out for. Like how many words in a quote is it before I have to do a block indent versus using quotation marks. So that's something you need to go back and read about. Other stuff, if there's multiple works by the same author, how do you distinguish between those, among those, when citing? So if Benjamin published 3 articles and you're citing all of them, and if they're all 2009, how does the reader know which one you're talking about? Well, the manual will tell you how to do that. Or if you have groups as the author, which things that people commonly cite as groups, whenever the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, publishes a report, NIMH is the author. For the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association, is the author. That group is the author for that source. So the manual has some guidelines about how to cite those things. If you're going to alter quoted material, either inserting words or deleting words to make, because sometimes, there's a quote and they say something the perfect way, but the way they said it doesn't quite fit in the sentence structure or the paragraph structure you're trying to work with. Maybe you need to change the tense of a word or a pronoun. It'll tell you what to do when you need to do those things. Also, if there's citations within quoted material, so there's a quote or there's something somebody said, and within what they said, there's quotation marks, or they quoted somebody else. Well, geez, how do I do that? Do I use single quotes, double quotes? Where does it all go? The manual will tell you about that. And then the last thing, classical works. If you want to cite things like the Bible or the Quran or the Torah, that's a little different than journals and books or websites, and the manual will tell you about that. So again, just know that the manual is a reference material. Consult it regularly, but again, if you don't read through it once, and not just kind of glazing over, but really kind of read through and look for what's there, you won't know what to look out for. So read it carefully, but don't try to memorize it. And good luck. If you have any questions about citing things, please feel free to ask me or any of the other professors. I'd be glad to help you.